come to the 10th presentation, and this is a special presentation. This is a foresight look at what is designed for 2010, for that year, for a complete new form of work that I have been doing now for well over 40 years. And it will be a year-long series of presentations, and the title for the overall is The Recalibration, as in the Renaissance, or the Reformation, or the Revolution. The recalibration. And what I have done is to put a very strong transform, a new transform, I'm not sure just what to call it yet, on the sophisticated 2-year program called the Learning Civilization, of which I did 12 versions of the 2-year program after working on it for 20 years before that. The recalibration will do in 4 parts in 1 year what took me more than 40 years to develop enough to be able to give a definitive final 2-year version. The transform is to show what a complete form is available for us to bring our consciousness in its ecology into play completely and wholly with the natural cycle, which is the base and the basis of what we must deal with, pragmatically, existentially, symbolically, and in our lives. The first set will be called field and form. That the form comes out of a field. The second set will be called flow and structure. How a structure comes out of a flow and is related geometrically to the forms that come out of the field, so that the flow actually occurs within the field. And the structure actually is an integral of the forms. So that this is a very sophisticated way of bringing into an idea the entire natural cycle that occurs from us, from the earliest glimmerings in nature to the final realization in our symbolic thought of a sense of who I am, who an I is, and the relationship between I's. The third section will be the transfield and the transform. It will take the field in the first part and show its higher registry in terms of an energy. If in nature one has an electron in the transfield, one would have a muon, a higher level. The transform is a different kind of a form in keeping with the transfield, which is a different kind of field. The first field, nature, is an integral field. Whatever forms out of the field of nature has a distinctive quality, and that is, it is a unity. It is, as we would say, it is a quanta because it is measurable, it is finite, it is capable of being given a number, a calibration, and that no matter how small or how large those aggregates, those collections, those integrals are, at every level, at every stage, they have a measurability which allows for us to be exact about what it is that they are. Even to the diminution of a point, and even to the expansion of a universe. It can be calibrated, it can be measured, it can be dealt with in terms of integral and unity and its relationality to belonging to a grand natural cycle, which is capable of completing itself. While the second field is a differential field, it does not complete, but differentially, it brings together possibilities without end. And so the differential field, which is a differential field of consciousness, deals with infinitude rather than unity. But the infinitude belongs to the field, and the forms that come out of the field give a recalibration. While they are expandable indefinitely, what they spectrum is definitely able to be appreciated, not in terms of a measurement of number, but in terms of a kind of a possibility which is able to be appreciated in terms of quality, but also logically in terms of a statistical number. We can be not 100% sure, but we can be very close to that. And that the difference there is that in the second kind of form, the conscious field has achieved the focus of someone who is conscious, who is doing the computation. In the natural cycle, we do not have to figure in the observer. We do not have to figure in the measurer, because the calibration always will be in terms of a primordial unity, a quantification, whereas in the other, it is a quality. And that quality can be, first of all, appreciated, and then it can be approximated very closely, and we can limit the possibilities to those that are most likely, the probabilities. So that probability in a statistical series of distributed applications can bring us quite close to what before was 100% was complete. In the pragmatic, now In the second kinds of forms, it is prismatic rather than pragmatic. One deals with a spectrum. And one can understand that that spectrum is not only of the possibilities and the logic probabilities, but has in its appreciative prismatic form the ability to project out the spectrum of possibilities. And so there is the fourth set. The first set was field and form. The third set was transfield and transform. The second set was flow and structure. So the fourth is transflow and transstructure. These are new words. A transflow is a differential flow within the field of infinite differential consciousness. Whereas the transstructure is related to the transform, and the transform is an art. So that the transstructure is a science. The arts are transforms, sciences are transstructures. That is to say, they are able to refine, to not only transform, but to transstructure as well. So that the sciences are related to the arts, specifically in the sense that as the artist can refine and make art forms, or make of themselves an artist who is capable of indefinite refinability, of making a kind of great art which is appreciable without end. One can not only appreciate King Lear by Shakespeare through one or two or three performances, but through a whole lifetime, through centuries of millions of lifetimes. One can listen to Beethoven's Sixth Symphony for several hundred years now and never exhaust the interesting ways in which performances can be given, which are distinctly different, which are distinctly Beethoven, but they're Beethoven in a completely new way. There was a great discovery in the classical music world about 50 years ago. Beethoven had been done in such magisterial ways that one thought there is no radically new way to present him until Herbert von Karajan came to do Beethoven. And all of a sudden, you realize that the game is completely open again. There are completely different ways. So that artists are able to make art forms that are indefinitely, infinitely refinable, and they can make, in the art of person making, a spiritual person who is inexhaustibly creative, whose spectrum continues to expand, and who cannot be labeled, curtailed, filed away, will not stay put. Whereas in the natural cycle, the tendency is to cherish staying put. In the differential cycle, what is cherished is being able to go outside the box. And even further, more radical, to go outside geometry. And even more revolutionary, to not require being positioned in any kind of relationality, to be completely free. That's the revolutionary change. Our recalibration takes it another level further. And that is when you have mastered the integral of fields and forms, of flows and structure, and you have gone into the appreciation and refinement of the transfields and the transforms, and learned to exercise a kaleidoscopic conscious ability to create even further, to prismatically expand even further, so that one now is able to understand that the trans structure is a cosmos and not a universe. And that cosmos is responsible and responsive in the sense that it respects, in responsibility, the creative refining of any prism in the entire cosmos who advances something further. So that the scintillation of the cosmos is startling. We look at the night sky and see the stars twinkling because of the change in the atmosphere. The cosmos has a kaleidoscopic twinkling in it because of the prismatic consciousnesses that populate it like a spice. The ancient way of insight of this, of being able to somehow find a visionary way of making an artistic image of what it is that one would see. Could you see with the kaleidoscopic spectrum of differential consciousness of the entire cosmos, what would one see? What kind of symbol then would you see? And we see it in Dante's Divine Comedy. 3 levels. In the Inferno and the Purgatorio, the first 2 parts of the 3 parts of the Divine Comedy, his trustworthy guide is Virgil. But Virgil cannot take him further than the end of the second, the Purgatorio. He needs a new guide. And he looks across and sees across this river in a chariot whose wheels are the many eyes of the divine swirling, and the rider in the chariot is Beatrice. His love, for whom in an existential way he only saw when she was 9 years old once in Florence. But the penetrating sharing of glance that they had stayed and matured with him all during his life, and towards the end of his life, in exile from Florence and Ravenna, he saw that she, grown to her cosmic person, was the only guide to take him through Paradiso. So when he gets there, he gets to the point to where he is able for the first time to see that he needs another guide. And what comes to him is an enormous eagle whose prismatic focus for him is the eye of the eagle. And that when he looks into the eye of the eagle and sees the pupil of the eagle, he sees what the eagle's pupil shows, the cosmos in not its entirety or completeness, but in its infinite beauty. And what he sees is a scintillating, infinite petaled white rose, And the petals of the white rose are the wings of the angels who keep adding to their population, adding to their choir, and that their song is a song without end of praise for God. We're looking at a recalibration in 2010 to make a form that takes but 1 year to completely recalibrate the entire natural cycle of field and form, of flow and structure, as well as the conscious ecology of transfield and transform, of transflow and transstructure. And that when that is accomplished, there is only a release into personal, spiritual exploration. And so there would be a fifth part that is left as a complementarity for self-refinement. No teacher needed. And I've provided for all of these, for the 4 parts for the year 2010, and for a quintessential 5th part in the spring of 2011, so that those who go through it may see how it works for themselves. So I have selected, like an artist, of teaching, the art of learning. I've been at the university level since 1958. So that's more than a half a century. Well versed as an athlete of how universities work, and also how not only universities work, but how cosmoversities work as well. Fortunately, I've never had to teach someone else's course. In 40 years of teaching, I always design my own courses. Not many can say that. Or if they have designed courses, they've designed maybe 2, 3, 4, maybe 10. I have designed hundreds and run them. So where would you begin? And the best way to begin is to begin with something that has so many interesting facets that it can continue to function not only as a beginning, but that the beginning continues its beginningness all the way through. And for us, the emergent classic way is to take a look at the I Ching. And so in the field and form, we're going to start with the I Ching, but start with the I Ching in a very special way. That paired, because we're not only dealing with pairs that have symmetry, but pairs that have tunability. Because the symmetry of the first cycle will be jacked up to a supersymmetry in the ecology. And that the tuning will be carried into a harmonic. So it's a very easy kind of 1-2 quality where the 1 and the 2 go together, except that we go not to the primordiality of 1 and 2, but we go to something that occurs before that primordiality, because a primordiality is based on the first one. But we're going deeper than measurability, deeper than quanta, deeper than number. We're going to the zero field, because only the zero field will allow us to appreciate that whatever emerges as form out of that field will instantly not only have a oneness, but it will be able to couple with any other oneness and make a two-ness then, because the template for the two was that the one came out of a zero. So that the very logicality of the expression of a natural cycle is that it is able to be characterized by a binary of 0 and 1. Computers work because that binary can be speeded up so that one only doesn't have 0 and 1 first time, but the iteration of it occurs now trillions of times for any time unit. Plato says time is the moving image of eternity. When eternity is characterized as moving, that is what time is. And that time having a unity then affects the blossoming of space then that will have a unity as well. That the three dimensions of space constitute a unity. Space itself is a unified thing. We're sophisticated enough now with astronomical orbiting equipment that we're poised to be able to see how the sun, our star, drags space in its axial spinning, in its orbit, and we can refine it now to be able to see that space itself is like a frame that occurs and can not only be seen to have a curvature, a gravitational curvature, but that also it can be pulled. It can be dragged. And the same is true of time, that dimensions themselves in their originating or origination from the field of nature have this quality of measurability, of detectability. But the transforms do not have a perimeter. So I'm going to introduce a pair of terms. One is that natural cycle occurrences will always have perimeters. The zero will be a no perimeter. But the second field, the field of differential consciousness, does not function in terms of perimeters, but in terms, and I'm using an ancient Sanskrit word here, instead of perimeters, it has a Pariana. It has a way beyond. And that the way beyond keeps being a way beyond. So that when one learns that you can deal with perimeters on any level of specification that is required, not only down to a point, but down to the vanishing of a point. It can be perimetered. That the vanishing itself is a no perimeter, which is a paradoxical perimeter. But the Pariana keeps going beyond. So that consciousness as an ecology is a magical friend who counsels us to continue to create. You're not going to exhaust your creativity. You're not going to paint yourself into a corner where you have done such and so many different ways that there's no different way to do it. That does not occur. the Pariana, has for its spectrum infinity. Just as the perimeters of the natural cycle will have a calibration, the scintillation of what would be parameters for consciousness in the Pariana are an infinite play, which is characterized by something that is extremely rare in the natural cycle. It's characterized by perfect freedom. That the spirit person learns to recalibrate themselves to an infinite perfect freedom. That the artist intuits not only that the works of art that you are able to make will be prismatic for those who come to appreciate it and who will generate then a history of a transflow, of a kaleidoscopic contribution, out of which the transstructure of the sciences will be able to come, and science turns out to be recalibratably, infinitely free. Instead of being an enemy of religion by trying to specify and make it face the facts, instead it turns out that the sciences, the Latin term Scientia actually many times is translated as knowledge. What is it knowledgeable of? It is knowledgeable of the knower. The knower knows they are perfectly free infinitely. And so there is an appreciation constantly of the unnecessary shackling that has occurred for our species in our history up to this threshold. And that many times it was challenged, but especially it was re-challenged 500 years ago in the Renaissance. It was primordially re-challenged. Man is no longer the individual who is able to be put into forms. He is the resonant artist of the cosm, the cosmic. And so he is a microcosm in the sense that he's not a small part of it. He is the opening for himself, for herself, to participate with the cosmos in such a way that the cosmos knows you, appreciates you. And so the appreciation becomes an exercise, an analysis, an analytic, and it turns out that an analytic is not to reduce something down to measurability, but a real analytic is to expand its Pariana so that one can appreciate the possibilities and the probabilities. And so with the I Ching, I am pairing the Tao Te Ching. And the technique is this: to give you something to begin, which in an integral way could be the center of a whole circle or the center of a square, but by bringing a second, not just a pair, but a tunability. This is like the ship, this is like the rudder or the sail. One can now move this around in such a way that it is a center that occurs everywhere. And the Tao Te Ching does that for the I Ching. I'm using my own translation of the Tao Te Ching in 2010 because it is a refined, recalibrated English. It is a transform of the English language that has gone through all the previous transforms. Old English, in which Beowulf, for instance, is written, was radically changed by Chaucer and confrères in the 1300s and became Middle English, which is completely different from Old English. You're better off going from German to Old English, but in Middle English, all of a sudden, you have something different. And one of the qualities of Middle English is that you must hear it, because the pronunciation of it has a rhythm which is a new level of poetic. Yes, Beowulf is an epic, and one can say that it has a kind of an epic quality, but its poetic is rather like an Iliad type thing. Once characterized by a great translator of the Greek, he said the Iliad is mysterious, like a big steel gray battleship being launched in a fog. You know that something massive is working, but you're not quite sure if you see it. But you can feel its enormity. Whereas Middle English is like the Odyssey. It has a skipping quality, and it's not about a king killing a monster and then having 50 years later to have to kill the mother who does him in too. Chaucer he said of himself, my writing is about a fair field full of folk. I'm writing about human beings. And in this way, the I Ching went through that. The earliest roots of the I Ching are all about the heavenly prototype of the way in which it works, whereas the transform of the I Ching, which brought in the Zhou dynasty about the time of the Trojan War, relates it in correspondence to human beings in their family. And what were before heavenly correspondences are now humanities correspondences, very much like a Beowulf to a Chaucer. A third level happened to the English language, and that was the refinement of Shakespeare. Shakespeare takes what Chaucer had done to the English language and makes of it a Renaissance language. And that language itself was transformed by the Revolutionary Age, by those great poets like Shelley and Blake, Wordsworth, Coleridge, all the way through to Yeats, all the way through to T.S. Eliot and Wallace Stevens. What I am doing in the various translations that I am using of my own work is to bring a further transform so that the English language now has capacities that Greek or Sanskrit or Arabic or all of the great languages of the kaleidoscopic heritage of the planetary family, that we have a new capacity. We're going to take a little break. I want to give you an example. This is the 25th section of the Tao Te Ching in my translation. Imaging the mysterious. There being everything's completion before heaven, earth exists, calm. Incorporeal. Singularity within the changes. Going wherever and not resisting, thereby becoming heaven, earth's mother. I don't know the name. The characterizing presence is called Tao. forced to become named, call it great. Great called elusive. Elusive called distant. Distance calls in returning. This great, heaven great, earth great, king also great. The world has these four greats, and the king dwells therein as one only. Gen follows earth, earth follows heaven, heaven follows Tao, Tao follows presence. 2,500 years ago. Let's take a break and we'll come back. Let's come back. The key to a super complex endeavor is to be able to enter it in such a way that you have a strategic advantage if you keep up its continuity. A work of art will always have the initial invitation to itself, to its performance, that if it maintains in the continuity of the prismatic form, the appreciation will then be able to have this infinity quality to it. And the infinity is not so much that the expansion of its meaning just becomes large and one never is quite sure. It's that you are able to keep a concourse of continuity going. And if you do in a work of art, one of the qualities of time that is transformed is that the recursion, the remembering of what it was that you just saw or you just heard, you just enjoyed, that recursion, that recursive quality to it has a parallel in the advanced foresight of what you're looking for to see if that is seen, seeable, if that is heard, hearable, etc. So one of the qualities of consciousness is that it has a future and a new past constantly, like a parenthetical quality that acts as a billows for the present time to become an array of presencing. So when we heard from Lao Tzu that in the 25th chapter of the Tao Te Ching, Tao follows presence. It's the whole principle of Feng Shui, for instance. If an architecture is placed exactly right in its context, in its landscape, in its urban scape, that architecture now acts as if it were the insight to the field of the nature. But if one is able to appreciate the art as well, the insight now is not only to the field of nature in which it occurs, but the other field, the field of consciousness, in which it has its expansiveness in perfect freedom. A good example of this is I'm using Thomas Jefferson as the insight into a field person related to him of Benjamin Franklin. Of Benjamin Franklin in his autobiography, who creates a field of what we would call the American person for the first time. No longer a European of this or that country, no longer a colonial, but someone who is now an original, different scale of person, which Benjamin Franklin was the first. He was the first American. Though he spent a great deal of his life in London and was famous there, the greatest years of fame in Paris, where he was lionized, he was the most famous person in France at that time. He essentially was a Boston boy who became the Philadelphia man. And so prismatically transformed Philadelphia that it became, for the first time, an American city. So that the pivot of the architecture in Philadelphia is Independence Hall originally. And it's interesting because Independence Hall is arranged in such a way that many buildings of great significance for Philadelphia as the first really purely American city surround Independence Hall like courtiers to the throne. And one of the all-star buildings there was established by Benjamin Franklin, the American Philosophical Society, which became, and still is, a massive exploration of everything of interest on the planet. The publications cover every conceivable kind of thing, and sets up a prototype that one finds in Washington, D.C. One finds the great pivot of the Washington Monument, tuned by the White House, the other end of the Capitol Mall, and surrounding great attendant buildings, some of the most famous in the world, all lined up. Before there was a capital of the United States, before Independence Hall was arranged in this way, Thomas Jefferson cut an angle of vision, of conscious insight into the future and recalibrating the past so it was a new past. And the first indication of this was his personal home, Monticello. And so Monticello becomes one of the most famous personal homes in world history. And it's not just that Monticello is the house, but the house has its arms of all the storerooms and the stables and the various places underneath walkways. And at the end of the walkways, small buildings. The first seed of Monticello was one of the small buildings which he made for he and his wife while he was doing all the different things he was doing and beginning to architecturally design Monticello. But the expansion of Monticello and the first indication of this prototype of the central pivot becoming the axis of an enormous central court, the courtyard not of some kind of a kingdom, but the courtyard of a transformed people. And that courtyard became the University of Virginia. This is the Cosmic Harmonic of Monticello. This is a home for learning for all people who can come there, who will come there. One of the most recalcitrant Americans of all time was William Faulkner. He hated to be disturbed by anybody for any reason whatsoever, because his style of writing was to project himself in kind of like a Scottish second sight, being able to see that the characters he was writing about were much more real than the people he could talk to. And he was trying to hear what they were saying to each other so he could write it down. And to keep himself anesthetized so he didn't get impatient, because there are things to do, he would drink his scotch. And so he would keep himself just inebriated enough so that he could continue to be in that second sight kind of conscious super trance so that he could do his writing. The only time, except for one, that he agreed to appear at a university was the University of Virginia. And he was completely open, and he let undergraduates question him and pick at him for days on end, and he was very happy to do this because he was in Jefferson's land. Because his mythical section of Mississippi was called Jefferson County, Yoknapatawpha, and his work. The University of Virginia is completely designed by Thomas Jefferson right at the end of his life. And he called it his academical village. This is the little publication University of Virginia Press put out. His academical village, because anyone who came here to learn, not to be the member of this or that country, this or that kingdom, but to transform their personage into a prismatic art of living. But this was very important to do. It was essential to do, especially because Jefferson, as the form related to the field of Benjamin Franklin, is very much like the Tao Te Ching related to the field of the I Ching, and that those two pairs, those two symmetries, tuned together, give us the prototype and the archetype of a frame, of a square of attention, of a shaping which we can then use as a template to give ourselves the stages and the steps by which it matures into its fullness. This is the time-honored repeat that goes through a continuous cycle so that the recursion and the foresight act together as expandable, parenthetical billows that energizes the sense of presence, so that one doesn't get stuck in a present moment in a time causality line. Because once you are stuck in that and you become inured to that, you become addicted to that. And you have to do something melodramatic to get out of it. You have to go ecstatic, or you have to go terrorific, or you have to go high Dharma, sudden wisdom, just to get yourself out of that line. It's not a rut. It is a linearity. And the linearity comes because the flow, and the next section is flow and structure. That flow is the flow of experience. And that flow of experience, because it comes from unities that have formed out of the field of nature, they tend to condition by success, by usability, by practicality, by the very pragmatic nature of the success and the practicality. Experience tends then to flow from that linearly. And in that linearity, the way to characterize it, and this is the right term to use, is that it is a plot line. The Greek word for that plot line is a mythos. It has a beginning, it has a middle, it has an end. So that it has a geometricity based on the line. And that points occur on that line. One has now made a fatal flaw. It is a fatal flaw from the freedom of the field of nature. The flaw is this: you cannot experience points vanishing. They do not vanish into the zero field of nature so that nature is mysterious. Instead, they are absorbed into the addictive geometry of the lines of causality. And that line of causality extends from the ritual basis, the existential unification basis, all the way through the flows of experience to the end of the line, the structures of the mind, the structures of symbolic thought, which are only too glad then to complete the circuit. And they complete the circuit not by receiving the existentiality, not only of things, but of the limited actions, the karma, but they receive it through all of the lines of experience now arranged into a structure. And to seal the deal, it sends back the other way indications of firming up the mental structure with the ritual existentiality, so that now, sending it back, one makes an identification. One makes an alignment that now we have identified that this is in alignment. A equals A. And experience then, in its linearity, becomes corralled into geometricity. So that the structure of thought becomes more and more geometrically abstracted by not having to go back through the forms to the field. And so becomes increasingly, in a natural way, through over-identification with abstraction from nature, is no longer even recognizing that nature occurs before the primordiality of things and actions. The mystery of nature is ignored. Ignored to peril, because the entire natural cycle has its juice by being able to emerge from the field of nature, not just once, where you don't do it and then that's an original sin, that's the fall. It's that the emergence is cut off. And in order to overcome the claustrophobia, the suffocation, the mental structures become more and more tyrannous, more and more tight, making sure that the identifications, checking them out. What else can we do to make sure that this is done right, that those things occur and those things don't occur, and that experience is more and more following the lines that you're supposed to follow. And so the constraint that comes into play literally suffocates itself from having no error from nature. And one of the qualities is that the zeros that punctuate the energies, the energy frequencies, and you have to visualize this now. An energy frequency is a symmetry. It's a symmetry of rise and fall around a center, but the center is not a line, it's a calibration of the energy of that existentiality, of that unity. The energy of a photon is not because there is a photonic line that is causality. It's that this is the energy of the photon, which is different from the energy of the electron, which is different from the energy of the proton. So that energy itself, which is the basis of form, which is the basis of how experience is generated, life is generated in the first place, becomes misunderstood radically. It's not an iteration of the zero field. It is a consequence of managing the numbers, starting with number one. And increasingly, the only way that that's able to be done is that the mental structure, the symbolic structure of thought becomes more and more condensed so that increasingly there's only one whose symbolic structure counts. In China, in the early Han dynasty, Han Wuti had 130,000 people working for just him. And whatever he said was supposed to be done. He was one-upped. Later, it was realized by the man who did this literally to a T. In Chinese, T means heaven, heavenly. Han Wuti was preceded by a man who in his name included Qin, and he said all Chinese people they're all Chinese. Everyone belongs to me. And in order to demonstrate his power, he made the Great Wall. What is inside this is mine, and what is outside of this is conquerable. It's a early play on a Hollywood statement made in Bud Schulberg's great Hollywood novel, What Makes Sammy Run? Sammy Glick, the ultimate Hollywood to-be tycoon. His motto was, what's mine is mine and what's yours is negotiable. His corollary was never promote a promoter. I have you covered more ways than you could imagine. So don't piss me off. And make sure that the deal favors me. The structures of the alienated, and this is a term from the 19th century, the alienated structure of thought becomes alienated because more and more what doesn't work in this is that the flow of experience does not flow in the things. It doesn't flow in the actions, the snippets of actions. It doesn't flow in the karma. It flows in the field of nature. So that when you cut off the field of nature, you starve the flow of experience. So you suffocate from not having nature as your field, but you become suicidal and panicked and neurotic, psychotic, because your flow of experience, those lines don't make sense anymore. They blur. They blur first to you. They don't make any sense. And then it occurs to others that what you're doing, what you're interested in, is crazy. Freedom is crazy to tyranny. What are you going to be free for? We own everything. We have the UFO technology. We own star systems. Who do you think you are? We have psychotronic control over you. We have metabolic control. We can nanonize anything. For whom are you going to be free? And the response is, the cosmos is free. You guys are the ones in trouble because we're coming on and we intend to be free and return freedom back into its harmonic. One of the problems in the field, like in the field of the I Ching, in the field of Benjamin Franklin, in his autobiography, he says, "My scheme of order gave me the most trouble. And I found that though it might be practicable where a man's business was such as to leave him the disposition of his time, that of a journeyman printer, for instance, it was not possible to be exactly observed by a master who must mix with the world and often receive people of business at their own hours. So that the more successful that you become in this kind of a world, the less opportunity you have to do your sense of ordering of your character, ordering of your symbolic structure, ordering of the things and actions of your life. And so the ability to go back and to look forward at the same time comes to a particular pivot of a pair. And the pair, it appears in a diagram in Benjamin Franklin's autobiography. The first part of the tunable pair is the morning question, what good shall I do this day? The pair to it is the evening question, what good have I done today? The evening retrospect and the morning prospect are an ancient Pythagorean tuning pair. And in fact, one finds that Franklin was very much like an ancient Pythagorean. And earlier on in the autobiography is another diagram of 14 qualities of character. Those qualities of character are the character of one's ability to experience and to keep track of your experience in terms of these 14. The diagram in the autobiography is on temperance. The first is temperance. Eat not to dullness, drink not to elevation. In other words, that the line of your food, of your diet, is to keep an energy flow which is in consonance with keeping your character free. Whereas if you gluttonize, you get dulled. If you drink too much, you become dull. So that the energy of the food now, for Franklin, and it's just the first of 14. The second is silence, the third is order, fourth is resolution, frugality, industry, sincerity, etc. He writes this: "It was about this time that I conceived the bold and arduous project of arriving at moral perfection. I wished to live without committing any fault at any time. I would conquer all that either natural inclination, custom, or company might lead me into. As I knew or thought I knew what was right and wrong, I did not see why I might not always do the one and always avoid the other. But I soon found I had undertaken a task of more difficulty than I had imagined. While my care was employed in guarding against one fault, I was often surprised by another. Because the habituation to a line of development obviates the ability to have a peripheral vision of other lines, and that this kind of a complexity is one that as you advance in taking care of certain lines of character, experience, and development, the others increasingly go astray into like a confusion, so that somebody trying to improve themselves in this way comes to a point to where they only make things worse. The limited do-gooder turns out to be the worst criminal. The really fierce savagery of human beings come from those who are disappointed at trying to control themselves completely. And so dictators look to controlling as many other people and other things as possible, because that way you limit the access of those who will confuse you. And the worst thing is to face a human being who is perfectly free. Jesus faced that condition in his own lifetime. Neither the Jewish hierarchy of the Sadducees or the Romans appreciated somebody who was perfectly free, had no causal lines of experience to tend to, because the transform of the person, pulling one's character through, not leaving it registering in the symbolic structure of thought, but pulling it through into a field of infinite differential consciousness, into the field of vision. This has a peculiar quality. In the Gospel of John, he says, you will know the truth, and the truth will make you free. It makes you free not just because you got there to vision, but vision has a recursive quality as well as a prophetic quality of the looking forward. It also looks back in new ways. And the first thing that it does is it changes the mind, the structure of symbolic thought. The structure becomes transformed. And in that transform, it is now able to have a memory. And the memory, because it's in the integral cycle, is exact as you need it. And because it comes out of an infinite remembering, one can have a memory of unlimited qualities. Unlimited. There was a famous issue early in the 20th century of whether Homer wrote or whether his epics were passed on orally, and everyone said that no one can remember an Iliad, an Odyssey. And then a researcher in the Yugoslavian area of Europe ran across Yugoslavian epic storytellers who knew epics 20 or 30 times as long as the Iliad by heart. Could quote you anything out of it. All of a sudden it was astounding. How can this be? The way that spies used to be trained in Rudyard Kipling's Great Game days at the turn of the 20th century, 1900, they would be put through paces where a sack of objects was dumped out on a table and quickly swept up together and put back in the sack, and you were supposed to be able to instantly remember everything that had been poured out there, training the memory. And in this way, the memory can be trained in such a way that it is enormous and exact, because it works not out of the lines of experience, but out of the field of vision. And the field of vision has infinite peripherality. Not only can one remember everything about your life, but one can remember past lives indefinitely. One of the great collections of stories in the world are the Jataka tales, the previous lives of the Buddha. There are 550 of them, when he was this or that animal, this or that person. And it is like a graphic presentation that when you have the field of consciousness in its differential infinity, one can remember past lives without end. The Buddha, one time in a sutra, was asked, has anyone ever achieved enlightenment by a way different from the one that we're pursuing? And the response was, in every conceivable system of reality, more than the sands of the Ganges, not a single one. Because the way is not a way, it's a Pariana. It's the way beyond the original teachings of Jesus. He called it the way. He didn't call it this or that. It was the way. The quality of Jefferson and Franklin, of the Tao Te Ching and the I Ching, sets up a way then that flow and structure are related to each other like field and form. The caveat is that the flow of experience, the flow of language, the flow of images, the flow of feelings, flows in the field of nature, does not flow in the forms. So that experience, when it really flows, it doesn't step from one stone to another. It courses, it flows. It's not connecting the dots, because the space between the dots is part of the resonance of the image, part of the resonance of the feeling. And by trying to reduce images and feelings and language to the dots, and then have them be absorbed into the lines of the geometry of what is permitted in terms of identification, identity, correctness, alignedness, all of that is a constraint that imprisons. And imprisons in such a way that not only does nature not occur as a field, consciousness does not occur as a field. And so one is isolated, bouncing back and forth between things and actions and symbolic structures and the need to control. And so you get a fatal ping pong game. And the only calibration that matters in that is what is the score and of winning. This is why someone who transforms because they have gone to the trance field as well as recovered their own symbolic structure free in the field of nature, traditionally they were called spiritual athletes. The ultimate Olympic is to live freely in reality. No one is keeping score because there is no score. But there is the play of the harmonic, of the resonances. We're running out of time, and I will continue with this next week to show that consciousness, in its ecology, is a kind of mysterious proofing of the way. And that the ecology of consciousness, the more that it is, quote, successful, the more that it works by tuning pragmatic with prismatic. So that one gets the art of cutting the facets of a stone to turn it into a jewel, and then able to see that the jewel has its sparkle. The jewel person in sparkling is the beacon of the value of someone wishing to do that themselves. The proviso is that one cannot emulate it. You can't replicate it. You must do it originally because it is your freedom. The key to it is that your character, if given enough air and latitude, enough atmosphere, will be able to tap your own access to the field of nature, which will provide you with the zero spaces so that you are no longer fearful of the alignment of the particular unities. And they're being checked on by the structure of a mind that is watching every identification to make sure that you don't cheat, you don't dream, especially you don't vision. What is being presented here is that the ecology of consciousness is an ecology. It's not a cycle. And it changes so that instead of a circularity, you get like an infinity sign. Instead of a square, you get a changing frame of references. One of my great students, originally here in Los Angeles, had been one of the great mathematicians, and his first job was with Arabian American Aramco Oil Company in Saudi Arabia, David Williams. He had a great experience there. When he first arrived, he looked out of his hotel window, and there was a brand new Cadillac convertible. And the sheikh that had just bought it was disturbed because he couldn't get it out of rear gear. And so in his anger, he tromped it and backed the brand new Cadillac all the way down to the wharf and off the wharf and just left it there. And 5 years later, when David left, he said it was still there rusting. No one dared move the sheikh's anger. But the same sheikh, when he got to know David, did not understand certain things, had him helicoptered with him to the empty quarter in the south of Arabia. And they spent a couple of hours there where it hasn't rained for 1,000,000 years. And the sand is brick red and is electrostatic so that you get crinkles of energy just spontaneously as soon as there's any kind of a movement of air whatsoever. And David said, after that, I began to understand. You cannot characterize someone who has a jewel-like personality by a single moment. You must get to know them in a completely new way. He, after completing my education for two-year cycles, applied for a position at NASA to be a shuttle controller. And they hired him, even though he was over age. But he was the first person in NASA to be able to understand a new computer language, C+, when it first came out, And the next oldest guy was young enough to be his son, because he had learned to recalibrate himself to be able to learn anything in its originality. And he became one of the great shuttle controllers. And he said he interviewed the last of the mathematicians and programmers who took men to the moon. He said they all told him, you cannot just go to the moon. You have to have navigation frames of reference changed and repeated many, many, many times per time unit in order to get a trajectory that mathematically you can be precise so that you land exactly where you're going to land right there. That if you try to do it without that, there's no way that you can do it. Celestial mechanics are too complicated. So one has to have the specificity of the integral, but one has to have the vision of the conscious. And when they work together, not only can you be real with each other, you can go anywhere at any time. The cosmos is infinitely wild and elegant. More next week.